Hi, this is Sarah here at Narrate. So this week, Adam will continue with The Goat Has Left the Building series by discussing what it means to reframe your appetite. This week, he will unpack why there's value on being clear on your identity and understanding who you are and what Christ brings to that.
So if you haven't been with us in a couple of weeks, we started a series on Easter that I think the why behind that will become just a little bit more clear as we go. But really what I want to do this morning is I'd like to provoke you to think about the value of being very clear on your identity. I don't even necessarily mean to sell you Christian identity. I just think that there's incredible value to navigating the myriad responsibilities and opportunities and obligations that we have from a very centered, very centralized, very defined, very articulated sense of who. And the need for this was certainly pointed out to me a couple weeks ago. So the Monday after Easter, my family and I drove to Billings because my dad and stepmom live in Billings, and my wife and I were headed to a conference in Nashville. It's a tough life. Someone's got to live it, though. So there's this conference called Q, and it is, if you went to Q, you would suddenly understand Narrate all the more. This is the 5th time I've been to it. It's a ideas conference. It's a common good conference where Christ followers are part of it, but it's not a church growth conference, and it's not a Christian conference. It's absolutely fabulous, and so it moves around. And so we were going to that conference, and my dad and stepmom had volunteered to hang out with our 3 boys for that week, and so we thought, well, let's just fly out of Billings and then back into Billings and simplify things for them that way. So we did. Now, context, when I got to the airport on Tuesday, is that my grandpa, who I knew well, who's been dead now for a few years, who retired about 15 years ago, my grandpa worked from his mid-20s into his 60s at Billings Logan International Airport. Some of you will be able to remember when airline jobs were these very competitive, very good jobs. And so very few of you, I would think, will remember an airline called Western Airlines. It was an airline in Montana, and then Delta bought them. So my grandpa worked his entire career there. He worked the gate. He worked, what do they call that, the tarmac. He loaded bags. He did all of the above. And so when I got to the airport, it was somewhat of a surreal experience. Not a sad one necessarily, but just, you know, if you've ever moved away, we've been gone from Billings now. I was raised there, but we've been gone for 5 years. And so it was somewhat surreal to be at the airport because you're seeing all this stuff that was familiar, but it's been a long time since you've seen it. And I had this sense of like nothing's changed. Not from a critical sense, but like they haven't done any remodeling. They haven't painted anything as best I could tell. The carpet's the same. Everything was just the same. And so at times I felt like a 10-year-old boy walking through this airport having memories of when I would walk through the airport with my grandpa and go watch him work and before security as we know it and all those different things. So then I got on the airplane and was looking out the airplane window and I was noticing, I think they call them tugs. Those are the like vehicles they pull the carts with that they put your bags on, but we don't ever put bags on them anymore because if we're willing to go through the fiasco of having a carry-on, it's free, but there's that whole deal. And all the equipment and the de-icer and the little machine that they push the airplane out with, all of that, and I just couldn't help but think, like, this is all old stuff. And I was just kind of reflecting on, wow, my grandpa did this and that, and I could picture all of it. Again, not sad, just this kind of like, wow, okay. And then we landed Friday afternoon or Friday evening, and as we landed and I looked out the window and there I could see the terminal kind of zoomed out a little bit and there's the guy with the cones, you know, and I'm going, oh, my grandpa did that. And there's the other guy with the cones who, you know, there's one directing the plane, one on the wingtip, all those different things. And it hit me in one of those, you know when you have these thoughts and you didn't go looking for these thoughts, but you just have the thoughts. I had this thought of, wow, like my grandpa, he spent his entire life doing this. He's been gone from doing it for 15 years, and the most honest assessment I could make is the place doesn't miss him. Like he poured his life into this place. He was very proud of what he did. He was a very good employee. He was a leader in the company. All those things that we would hope would be the case in our own lives, and yet I was just struck by the temporal nature of work. And I just couldn't help but think, like, wow, these people, they don't even know who he was. They don't even miss him. Like, people are still getting on airplanes. People are still getting off airplanes. Planes are still taking off. Planes are still landing. Peanuts are still getting put on the plane. All that stuff is still happening. And this person who could have so easily thought that if he didn't do it, it wouldn't happen, well, he would have been wrong if he did because he's gone and it's happening and they don't miss him. But you know who does? His family, his kids, his grandkids, his friends. And all of that just kind of reasserted everything that we designed to talk about in this conversation, which is, you know, the goat has left the building it's about Easter. It's about identity. It's about when you choose to follow Christ, should you choose to follow Christ, that your identity transfers from what you've done and haven't done, from like what good things you've done and what bad things you've done. The whole identity shifts, and it shifts to Christ, what he's done. What the cross accomplished, the goat leaving the building is all of your past being gone. The priest sitting down, if you're with us on Easter, is that the system is over. Jesus fulfilled it. We are in Christ. And this series is about the reminder that, wait a minute, to be in Christ is about way more than saying, I believe in Jesus and I get to go to heaven when I die. It's about understanding we're forgiven. And then as Paul talks about learning, what does it look like to clothe ourselves with the identity Christ offers? So if you're a guest this morning, or if you're someone that you're not so sure about the Jesus piece, I get that. Most of what we're going to talk about this morning is an out for you. You don't have to do any of it. You just get to sit back and consider it from the perspective of, if you chose to follow Jesus, what would you be choosing as an identity? And yet I'd also like to challenge you. You have an identity. Like when you go to Target, you're picking one. Like that's part of the Western capitalist world that we live in, is an identity construction marketplace. Your phone is an identity statement, right? The computer, identity statement. The clothes you wear, the brands that you're willing to exhibit, the stickers on your car, or whether or not, everything we do. It's what marketers understand about the human psyche to such a high degree. Humans are people who want identity, and so much of the consumer culture is selling you an identity. That's not necessarily bad, it just is. And so it all provokes in me this question: have you given much thought lately to who you are? Not like male, female. I don't even necessarily mean Christian, not Christian. I mean, what makes you, you? What unique parts of your person, what defines you, we might say? Who are you? Not those kind of surface level things, but what are the identifiers that drive the way you live? Rob Bell wrote a book a couple years ago called What We Speak Of When We Speak of God, and in it he talks about this idea that our physical persons, that the molecular cellular level completely replaces itself every 8 years, which means that if you're older than 8 years old, you are a completely different person physiologically. Like on the cellular level, you are a completely different person than you were 8 years ago. There's an anatomy professor that teaches at Carroll that's a part of this, and she was at 8:30, and I afterwards like, so was that right? Because that's nerve-wracking. And she said, there's one exception: eggs. Ladies, you're stuck with your eggs forever, I'm told. And neurons. Speaking of eggs, I had this funny story. Do I have time? Well, it turns out I do. So there's this. So my youngest son, my wife is a nurse, and she is very literal, and body parts are all very literal. And it's not that she's legalistic, but it's like she doesn't like the fun names that boys have for things. And one of the boys, did I already tell this story? I feel like I might have told this. Our youngest was like, "Hey, Mom, when I get old, I want to have a boy and a girl." And so she went off on this long diatribe. They were headed to the skeet hill. How you don't really have control over that because there's the sperm and there's the egg, and the sperm kind of determines because you need these chromosomes, and this long, like several minute explanation as to how he doesn't get to choose what gender his kids are. And when she finally finished up her very proud lecture, he said, "Mom, I was talking about dogs." So who are you? Because you're more than the sum of your parts. Some cultures have called it the soul, some would call it the psyche, some would call it the spirit. I'm not interested in the exact word. What makes you, you? And you know something, my story about my grandpa, that's not a criticism. It was actually a kind of a worshipful, defining moment for me, because what I realized is that his life is like your life, is like my life, and that is we have a ton of responsibilities. And so did he. He was a great employee, and I think that's important. And yet as this 30-something man looking at this platform that he had lived his entire life on, and we're all dependent. Listen, we all think that the thing's going to stop if we go away, but the fact of the matter is it's not going to stop. Someone else, we're all replaceable. What struck me in that moment, was that he did well. Because I wasn't bitter. I wasn't mad. I was proud. I felt loved and valued. I think he navigated well. I think he must have lived from a place of clearly defined identity. Listen, if you're a student, I know that people, they have this dumb thing they say to you that it's the best time of your life. Not true. Like, those of us that aren't students, we remember the pressure. Like the pressure of, there's this question people ask, so what are you going to do when you graduate? I don't know. I'm going to go to college so that I don't have to answer that question yet, so I don't have to know yet. Because there's this sense of like the rest of us who now we're doctors and attorneys and leading stuff and working places, like we've had it figured out, like we came out of the chute and we knew what we were going to be. And anybody who tells you that, they're lying. They felt the pressure you feel. And when someone says, what are you going to do? You're like, I don't even want to be 17, like because I feel 12. I don't want to be an adult. I don't want to have to go to support myself. Dad drives a nice car, right? If you're in college, it gets even worse. Become a junior or a senior, and suddenly you're going to graduate with a degree that you don't even know that you want, and you thought you went to college to make money. Turns out you just spent a lot of money. And now you're finding out that you don't even get paid that much money, like you should have went and done something where you didn't spend a bunch of money. There's that whole thing. There's all this pressure. And then we've just talked about the vocational side. Then there's the social side, and there's the what group are you going to fit with, and what are you going to wear? And maybe you're at this place where you're like, man, I thought when I was at this point I'd have met the one, but the one doesn't think she's the one doesn't think he's the one, I haven't met the one, now what? Pressure. I don't think the way to get through it is to simplify life. I think the way to get through it, maybe, I guess this is the suggestion, is what if the way to get through it is to operate from a clearly defined sense of self. If you have a young family, you're beyond all that pressure. Like you thought things would settle down when you got to where you're at. Joke was on you, right? Because now, like, you don't even, now it's not just you, it's you and her, or it's you and him, or it's you and the mortgage payment, and like you want to go to work and you want to do a good job, but then you got this dumb toilet that needs fixed, and paint's falling off the house, and the roof, and all these things, and then your car, it doesn't work, and there's all this stuff. And you think, man, when the diapers go away, then it'll settle down. But then you talk to your friends who have kids that are in like middle school and high school, and it's like, no. You don't ever want them to take off the diapers, because when they take off the diapers, then they have their own lives, and they have soccer and volleyball and softball, and they're like everywhere, and they have their own minds, and they've got their own things they want to do, and you're just like busy 24/7. And then I have conversations frequently with people who were beyond all that, and they thought that when they were in their 50s and 60s and life would start settling down, the pressure they feel now is completely different and greater. Because now they're looking at retirement. Now they feel very mortal. Like 30 years, 20 years, 10 years doesn't seem that far away. And the pressure you feel when you're there is just insurmountable. See, I think, and listen, if you're someone that you're not sure what to do with Jesus, here's one place where maybe it will be helpful. I think one of the great travesties of Western Christian thought, and I know that sounds so pretentious, and it is pretentious because I have not studied anything, but I still would stand by. I think one of the great travesties of Western Christian thought is that this book is full of things to do. That God is like a principal, that he's like a controlling father, that he's someone that says, like, just let me tell you what to do. And to me, that's such a travesty. Because going all the way back to the garden, God's interest wasn't in telling people what to do, it was to tell them who they were. Because his sense was if people lived from a clearly defined sense of self, then what you're going to do for a career and how you're going to make it through the baby years and what you're going to do like beyond death, all those things will just become a whole lot cleaner, more defined. And so this morning, I guess what I want to do is I want to look at one of the most remarkable, counterintuitive stories in all the Bible, because it's about a guy who lived this remarkably defined life in the midst of more chaos than I think any of us could ever appreciate. His name was Joseph, and so before you fall asleep, like I've heard the Joseph story, just give me 10 minutes. See, Joseph, he was raised in a situation that was very unique. He was very privileged. He was the youngest of several brothers. And sadly, his father was very passive. And because his father was passive, there was a favoritism vibe in his house. And his brothers hated him. Because see, his brothers, like they had to go out and they had to do things. They had to do physical work and they had to do all this stuff. And like Joseph, he just sat inside and, I don't know, painted pictures or something. Played Xbox. And the resentment was very deep. And one day, the father, Jacob, said to Joseph, like, hey, go find your brothers. Like, you're kind of drinking too much Mountain Dew and sitting around too much. Like, get outside and do something. So he told him to go find his brothers, and he went, and it was a several-day journey to find his brothers, and he found his brothers, and for the first time, his brothers had power over him, and so his brothers looked at him, and they started to figure out, like, what could we do to take advantage of this situation? And of course, what they did was they decided to throw him into a hole. Now, we think probably that hole was a cistern because in this part of the world, limestone is the main rock. And what would happen is that these natural caves would form. And in the rainy season, these caves would fill with water. And that would become the water source for people. Wars would be defined by this. Cities would be built around this. And so the result was that they threw him into one of these things because they'd become progressively more empty as the seasons got long. And as he was in the hole, and they're kind of just trying to scare the heck out of him, the one brother who was trying to protect him, he kind of left the scene. We don't know why. And he looks up, and there's this guy, selling all these wares. He had these like velvet paintings of Elvis, and he had these like fake Rolex watches and all kinds of like stuff, because that's what this guy did was he sold stuff. He traded stuff. And so eventually the brothers went, well, let's sell him to him. Like, he sells velvet paintings of Elvis. He can sell our brother too. And they did that. And this guy took him to Egypt, and there he was sold to a guy named Potiphar. Now, Potiphar, we think, was the chief executioner in Egypt, which makes him a very scary, very powerful man in a very big country. And it's fascinating to me. Listen, this makes no sense. I mean, you want to talk chaos. This guy's now a slave in Egypt. And yet, listen to the way the text speaks of this. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered. Well, that messes with my definition of God being with me and prospering, because he's now a slave in a foreign land nonetheless, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Jamie, I wonder if we could mute Sarah's mic. I'll bet you that's what's going on. Thanks. Joseph found favor in the eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. And so Joseph, he becomes this main worker in this very scary man's house. And of course, you probably know the story. Eventually, Potiphar's wife takes a liking to him. And historians speculate that this probably wasn't the exception but the rule. But nonetheless, Joseph said no, which is interesting. A guy who's basically been denied everything is now getting the opportunity to have this pleasure, and he says no. That says something about him. And she doesn't like being told no, because that's the way people who don't like to be told no are, right? They don't like it. And when they're told no, it gets scary. There's whole people, they have a whole industry on these people. It's called boundaries. That's the issue. And so she frames him. She corners him. She tries to get aggressive. She tries maybe to get seductive, but he still says no, and she doesn't like it. And she takes his shirt, because he does the only thing you can do when faced with sexual temptation. You don't reason and ration and think your way out of it. You run, right? And so he runs, and she grabs his shirt, and she claims rape. And her husband gets home. And again, it was interesting to me that so many scholars think that his husband probably didn't believe her, because if he did, he would have just killed him, is the thinking. Maybe he knew that this wasn't the exception. Maybe this was like those kind of royal marriages where they kind of didn't even, you know what I mean? Like they were just separate lives, but they were kind of these public figures. Who knows? But Potiphar throws him in prison. So here he is again, like this favored person. And listen to what the text says about him. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that he was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. It's Shawshank Redemption, right? And Joseph is in charge, he's in control, and he's doing these things, and God is with him. And then a couple guys get thrown in jail, one being a cupbearer, who was like the executive assistant of the Pharaoh. Wouldn't have been the official confidant of the Pharaoh, but functionally speaking would have been, because he was right at his side, because if he was going to eat or drink anything, he had to taste it to make sure it was up to his standards and not poisoned. The other person thrown in jail was the baker. Something's going on there. And they have dreams. And Joseph says, hey, I think my God can interpret your dream. And he says to the cupbearer, no sweat, you're going to get out of here. And he says to the baker, sorry, dude, like, tough luck for you. Which, again, says something about Joseph, because if he was a people pleaser, he could have just said to the baker, like, same with you. And then when they hauled him off to cut off his head, he's like, what is Joseph out, other than his word? And so that all happens, and Joseph says, hey, remember me when you get there, and he doesn't, and a couple years pass, and the Pharaoh starts having dreams, and the Pharaoh can't figure his dreams out, nor can the wise people of his world, and so the cupbearer says, hey, I remember this guy Joseph, he could interpret dreams, and he brings Joseph out of prison, and he has Joseph interpret his dreams, and Joseph says, hey, turns out you should have an emergency plan. Because there's going to be 7 years of prosperity followed by 7 years of famine, so you need to prepare accordingly. Now, the Pharaoh, we don't know, did he talk to Potiphar? Somehow he knew something about this guy because he immediately goes, okay, thank you, and you're in charge. Like, you answer to no one other than me. Make this thing happen. Build that building. Like, take us there. And he does. And of course, the big climax of the Joseph story is when they're in the midst of the 7 years of incredibly down times. What happens is his brothers show up. Now, again, I have to wonder, like, was he waiting for them? Was he thinking they were hopefully starving? What was happening? Because people from all over that part of the world, they were coming to him, and his brothers show up, and he immediately recognizes them, but they don't recognize him. And he has this interaction with them to the point where on several occasions he's got to slip out into the side room, bawl his eyes out, collect himself, and come back. And as the climax builds, like, what's he going to do? Because he can finally pay back the people who did unspeakable things to him. He offers his grace and his forgiveness. And in that regard, he's a huge type or foreshadowing of Christ as we understand God's heart for brokenness. But see, here's my question. Like, what the beep? Like, how do you do that? How do you live that way in the midst of all that turmoil? Do you like deep water? See if this tangent works. That's one of those that I think just makes sense to me. But do you like to jump off high things into deep water? Backflips, high dives, cliff jumping, all that. I'm not much of a fan. But why are you laughing? You should be surprised by that. Because I've done it. I've done it several times. My wife went off the 30-foot one. I went off the 10-foot one. It's the way we roll. But here's what I've been thinking about. Like, as much as I don't like deep water, like when we go to the swimming pool, I'm like, hey, okay, I don't need the deep end. Like, what point is there in the deep end? Like, I can do everything in the shallow end that I can do in the deep end other than jump in. There's something about the sensation of being in deep water that I'm actually starting to envy. As I think about life and responsibility and tasks and all that we have to get done, there's something about, like, when you're 10 feet deep in a river that I think is very clarifying. I think it's one of those rare moments in life when your, like, hormonal self and your intellectual self are in perfect harmony. When your spirituality and your ethics and the moment, they all align. Like, it's one of those rare moments, right? There's the part of you that sets the alarm clock, and then there's the part of you that responds to the alarm going off, and they're on different planets. It's one of those rare places where all those parts of you align. Because think about it. How many of you have ever had to think about, after I hit the water, then what do I do? Like, how many of you are like, okay, I'm going to jump off this cliff, but then I'm going to jump into the water, and I'll be 10 feet deep, and am I an amoeba? Like, what do I do when I get there? How many of you ever jumped off and got 10 feet deep and then went, I wonder what I should do now? Maybe I'll swim over here. Maybe I'll check out the bottom. I don't know. Maybe I'll call somebody. No, suddenly everything's really, really clear, right? Why? Because suddenly who you are is crystal clear, and all of your parts agree. You are a mammal, and you do not have a blowhole, which has only one possible conclusion, right? Get to the surface. See, when I look at the scriptures and I see the way it talks about who we are, it seems like that's what they're doing, is they're saying, listen. If you would live with this clearly defined sense of self, then all of the chaos, all of the responsibility, all of the overwhelmedness, suddenly you'll have some clarity. Because who you are will define in those moments what to do. And listen, that's not just a Christian thing, that's an identity thing. Your identity wins, would be one way to say it. You want to understand what you do and why you do it. It's born out of this sense of self, and you have one no matter how intentional you are with it or not. And I think the way we explain Joseph, and I think what the scriptures have for us as a gift and in his story, is his clearly defined sense of self. Listen, how do we know that he had this overriding sense that God was with him? There's only one possible way I'm going to argue. Because Joseph had it. And when Moses or whoever wrote Genesis down, when they were recording the story, Joseph made it very clear to somebody, listen, the whole time, I knew God was with me. Let me ask you this, what would you do differently if you had this overriding sense that God was with you? See, I think Joseph lived with this, what the word I would call it is dependence. That Joseph lived in the conscious sense that I am dependent upon God, and because I'm dependent upon God, and because he is faithful, he had this oftentimes even annoying sense of, I don't know, am I in Egypt? Am I in jail? I don't know. I'm dependent upon God. That's who I am. In Genesis 3, in the garden account, there's 2 temptations. The first one is what? You will not surely die. What is that? You can live life without God. You'll be just fine. It'll be okay. Joseph, I think, knew the story and made a conscious decision to identify himself with the faith tradition that said, I am made by God and dependent upon him. Now, again, I'm not trying to even persuade you necessarily, or maybe I'm trying to persuade you, but I'm just saying, like, here's the options. If you put your stuff on the goat, when the goat leaves the building, Joseph says the next step is you are dependent. See, the rest of the story with my kids with us going to Billings to fly out was about a year ago. My dad had asked, hey, when you go to that conference next time, we'd like to take the boys to Disneyland. Somehow we'd communicated perhaps that we didn't have any designs on going to Disneyland. Nothing against Disneyland, all you Disneyland lovers. Just wasn't in our plan. I don't know. Anyway. And so we drove to Billings, and we actually flew out simultaneously. And in Salt Lake, when we went to Nashville, the boys with my dad and stepmom went to L.A., but I got to tell you, for the last year, it's kind of wrecked me. Now, this is not a reflection of my dad or my stepmom, but of me. But as a dad, I had this sense of like, wait a minute, they're going to be in LAX. Like when I go to LAX, I need medication. That place is terrible. And I'm going to be in Nashville. And I could maybe you do this too. Maybe you're crazy like I am. Like you could hear the phone call. Hey, we lost Chase. And I'll be in Nashville. And the sense that I wouldn't be with them to protect them and make sure they didn't get lost and they did get through security and they did drink some water and they didn't drink Mountain Dew and all those things was gone. And it was this, the goat has left the building conversation for me when, Adam, are you a Christ follower or not? Because if you are, central to the way Paul says to clothe yourself, central to the identity that God calls you to put on, is to put back on the shirt that Adam and Eve took off. To choose that you can't do life without God. To choose that you're trusting him to take care of your kids. I think dependence is central to the identity that Jesus invites us to live with. But the second one that I think Joseph models, and this is the one that actually got me fired up, was I think there's something that's really easily missed about Joseph's self-ascribed understanding of himself. Let me just read you something. This is what he says to Potiphar's wife. But he refused. With me in charge, he told her, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns has been entrusted to my care. Listen, every leader, every boss, every owner wants people who have that type of an understanding, don't they? Everything, no one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you. You are his wife. Joseph, you might say, was a man who understood authority. He understood accountability. Joseph understood that he was a man under authority, and he wasn't going to push back on that. You know, Jesus twice, I think it's twice, don't quote me on that or tweet it or anything like that. I think it's twice, though, where Jesus actually praises somebody's faith in the Gospels. One of them is the Roman centurion, and the Roman centurion comes to Jesus and he says, hey, someone in my household is sick, come heal him, would you? And Jesus says, yep, let's go. And he saddles up the crew and is like, we're going to go to this guy's house, which is shocking enough because he's Roman. But then the guy says, remember what he says? No, you don't have to go. Like, I'm a Roman general. I understand authority. When I tell someone to do something, they do it. I get that. So listen, all you need to do is say, be healed, and they'll be healed because you have authority over everything. And Jesus goes, whoa, haven't even seen faith like this in Israel. What's going on there? The sense of authority. The second temptation in Genesis 3 is what? You shall surely not die, and you shall be like God. Walk up to a giraffe in the zoo and say, you can be like God. You'll end up laughing at yourself. They don't aspire to be God. Walk up to your dog and say, you can be like God, and he'll say, I already am. Just kidding. Actually, I think that would be your cat. Joseph understood, listen, I am a man under authority. I identify myself with Christ. I am not God. I answer to him. Listen to the way he finishes this. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? Amidst all the turmoil, 10 feet deep in the water, Joseph seemed to go, okay, who am I? Who am I? Who am I? I'm a mammal and I don't have a blowhole. I'm a mammal and I need to get to the surface. I am dependent and I am accountable. And that drives what I do. The second instance where he says this, and this just, I just think this is brilliant. So his brothers are standing in front of him, and the climax is, what's he going to do? What's he going to do? And Joseph finally looks at his brothers, and he says, okay, here's what I want you to do. And then he says this, do this and you will live, for I fear God. See, in the moment, in the chaos, it wasn't about the fact that he was a slave, and it wasn't about the fact that she wanted to sleep with him, and it wasn't about the fact that his brothers wronged him. It was all about the fact that he was a dependent, finite being, and he was accountable to God. You know the Jewish hat, the kippah or the yarmulke or whatever you want to call it? There's this long storied tradition because it's almost entirely extra biblical. And so you can read about where did that come from? Why did they wear that hat on their head? Well, one of the more common stories I researched this years ago, one of the more common beliefs is that the Jews, it was a reminder to them that God was above them. And I think that's unfortunate cosmology, this versus that, but that's its own conversation. But because God was above them, that meant two things to them. They were dependent upon him and they were accountable to him. And it was a reminder to them, God is watching over us and sees everything we do, which means he's with us and we can count on him, even if the outcome is apparently tragic. It means I'm accountable to him no matter what the circumstances might otherwise dictate. I had a professor in college. His name was Dr. Utrowski. I avoided him like the plague. He was the type of professor, I was an English minor and he was an English professor, and I took all the hippie instructor classes up until that point, and then I got to a point where I couldn't avoid him anymore. But you would have avoided him too. He was this southern man. He wore a denim corduroy suit every day. He was very, had perfect posture. He had this beard that he had like the oils in before it was cool to have the oils. Perfectly, he literally looked like the self-portrait of Vincent van Gogh. If you could just kind of Google that, that's what Dr. Utrowski looked like. He just looked really, really rigid. Finally, I had to take a class with him my senior year and really liked him, and then I was excited when, after that, I took a class from him called Senior Portfolio, which is the last class you take as an English major or minor. And so I sat in there the first day, and Dr. Utrowski, who was very proper, very Southern, I think he was from like Memphis, Tennessee or something, so totally he was so hipster before hipster was cool. And he started the class, and he was explaining that what we're going to do is we're going to do several pieces of writing every week, and then by the end of the year, we're going to create a portfolio with 12 pieces of writing in it, and that will have defined our growth as technicians with the English language over the course of our 4 years at that school. And some hippie idealist college kid next to me who was a friend, he raised his hand and said, okay, but do we have to follow the rules of grammar? Because after all, they're all a human construct anyway. Check. Dr. Utrowski didn't even flinch. He said, no, you do not have to follow the rules of grammar, the basic things you've learned over the course of your last 16 years of public education, because they're all human constructs. They're relative. They didn't come from the divine. Someone made them up. You don't have to follow any of them. And then he said, but every time you break a convention, you need to footnote it in the piece, and then on the end notes, you need to say what convention you just broke, and then tell us why you thought it best in this instance to break that convention. Check, mate, right? Game over. I think that's what a well-defined sense of self can do for you. Listen, life, it requires all kinds of response. And sometimes what's moral is really easy in this context and really hard in that context. And sometimes, it's so simple here and it's not simple out there. And sometimes you're dealing with things. Listen, what a clearly defined sense of self does is to go, listen, who am I? How am I going to be defined? What makes me, me? And if I'm going to, kind of creatively deviate from that, it'll be out of intentionality and creativity, not out of compromise. Listen, if you're a student, I understand how overwhelming it all is. We all do, even though we so quickly forget. Can I just encourage you to stop worrying about what you're going to do and start figuring out who you're going to be? Because what God gets from our lives is who we become. What you get from your life is who you become. And every gray head in this room will tell you, man, the details you have so little control over. Just figure out who you are and stay true to that. If you're a young family, a part of a young family, leading a young family, listen, we can all appreciate, those of us that are beyond diapers and babies and all that there's so much busyness. And then when they get into middle school and high school, so much craziness that you just respond. You are no longer living, you are surviving. Like, nobody tell the kids they're in charge. You're just trying to live till when they leave. Could you just slow down and remind yourself who you are? And when you walk down the aisle with him, when you made that decision when you were 19 years old, when you got yourself into this mess, who you said you were then, and to figure out how to stay true to that. Listen, those of you that are navigating things like, you're going like, you think diapers are hard. Try having to get up 4 times a night to go to the bathroom. Like those of you that are getting older and you're going, you have no idea what overwhelmed even means. Really? I thought that was funny. You guys didn't think? That's because you're all young, that's why. This is a council meeting this week, and my friend Jim would walk around the room like 3 or 4 times and refill our glasses of water, and then he kind of did this sarcastic laugh, and he said, you guys are going to be up all night going to the bathroom. Anyway, sorry, I digress. Isn't the point of Christ that whatever it is you face is all of a sudden all the simpler? If you operate from a sense of, I am loved by God, saved by his grace, dependent upon him, and accountable to him. Listen, I asked a therapist professional this week, okay, so I get it. I don't understand, because we can all get to this place where we get the answer in our head. The problem is when life starts happening, I don't have time to remember what my head knows, right? Talk about identity here, so easy, go to work, really hard. How do I do this? I said, how do I activate my brain? You know what her answer was? Relax, breathe, teach yourself how to slow down. You know what that reminds me of? A several thousand-year-old Judeo-Christian tradition of starting your day in solitude and silence, where you get into that chair, and if you only have 10 minutes, so be it, and you breathe deep, and you remind yourself and you allow God to remind you who you are. His interest is not to tell you what to do today, but to remind you who you are, and then to trust the agency he's given you to live that out. Listen, if you're trying to follow Jesus and you're trying to do that without some level of measured solitude and silence, I don't mean this in a crass or cynical way, but good luck. You've got to find that space. And if you're someone going, I'm already doing that, well, then the next step is, 201, which is finding that space throughout the day. Her challenge to me was, Adam, take one deep breath an hour. Ask me how many times I've done it. Sounds easy. God wants to know who you are. And then say, hey, let's go live this thing called life. Let's bring glory and honor to my name. Let's provoke people to rethink who I am. So listen, I don't know where you're at with Jesus, but should you choose to follow him, that's the invitation. And if you've already chose to follow him, that's probably what you signed up for in the first place.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.